Good evening, and welcome to Australian Literature 102. Welcome back if you've been here before. Today we are here to talk about Les Murray, probably, I think it's fair to say, Australia's most eminent living poet. And to talk about Les Murray's poetry, we have David Astle. Now, most of you will know David, I'm sure, from his word column in the Sydney Morning Herald, and his regular cryptic crosswords, signed DA, which appear on Fridays in the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, which are far too hard for me, and possibly even from his recent book Puzzle, which lets you in a few secrets of the genre. So, without further ado, David is going to speak for a little while on Les Murray, and then we'll have a bit of a chat about him.
Thanks, James.
No problem.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to let you in on a secret. I actually left my notes at the news agency at about 5:30 this afternoon, but there's two elements of good news attached to that. One is that I can confirm I left the notes at the news agency, and they are there because there were sundry materials that I would need to exist and remember things in my life. And the other element of good news is that I've got Les Murray down. He's in my head, he's in my blood, he's in my system. So I wasn't too perturbed about a lack of notes. I have the book, I have James to prompt, and I have your questions as well later in the session. There's a quote here from Les Murray that said that serious readers of poetry are almost the equivalent of those who play the card game scat. That is, it's a finite number of people, and just doing a rough count of heads, I'd say there's probably some very hardy souls here. Let's say there's 50 or 60 people. Probably a few more over at Amy Park watching Manly versus the Melbourne Storm. Certainly Les wouldn't be there, he'd be here. So we're amongst the faithful. We're amongst the scat players, and the others they can scat. So how is it that I came to fall in love with a bloke called Les Murray, if I can put it in those terms? I'll tell you that at the onset of 1990, I was swimming naked in Muckalong Creek in a little place called Wee Jasper, just out of Canberra. And my girlfriend at the time was naked as well, and it was New Year's Eve. It was very hot. We were camping beside the creek, and I proposed to her nakedly, barefaced, and I said, "Will you marry me?" And she said, "Only if you'll marry me." Now, she's been playing with my head ever since. That's 21 years ago, and she's still my wife. So my girlfriend at the time is my wife at the time. But then a fateful thing happened some 24 hours later. We were driving from Wee Jasper to Albury and along the Victorian-New South Wales borderline, and there was a stone on the road of the Corryong Highway that had a plaque on it. And I was driving, so I didn't have to ask. I just pulled over and had to go and check out this historical marker. Now, what the historical marker said essentially was that you were standing on the site of Old Tallangatta, or Tallangatta, as I first pronounced it, not knowing very much about the area. And if you don't know the story, Tallangatta was the town that had to move to make room for the Hume Weir, which was extended in something like 1965. Don't quote me on that figure, it was in my notes. But when that town moved, when that Hume Weir was extended, of course, the old Tallangatta had to move to become the new Tallangatta, 5 kilometres down the road. And because it was severe drought during the time that we dropped by, just after that fateful swim, I noticed that the weir was so low that you could actually see the ghostly template of the old town. So I walked around and found just strange objects, like a mossy piece of porcelain. I could see the roots and stump of an old tree. I could see the outline of what seemed to be the bank. It was on the corner in quite a heavily bricked building. Anyhow, there's a line here from Les Murray's poems. It is in Oh, by the way, it's just 2 lines. It's in it's called The Transposition of Clermont, and it's page 110 if you've got the book with you. It's just a couplet, but this couplet really captured my. It began my connection with Les Murray, and the couplet reads like this: "Everything standing in its wrong accustomed place. My generation's memories are intricately transposed." That's describing a place after a flood, so it's very similar to the old and new Tallangatta, because when you think about it, where you live is a very integral part to who you are. You understand the logistics of the place. There are memories associated with trees and with pieces of furniture and with angles of the street and with the way the light falls. And to have all that mixed up into this kind of municipal anagram and relocated in another location, it would be a very unsettling experience. I was so moved by that civic experiment that I decided to live, despite my fiance's wishes, in this area for the next 18 months, researching what would eventually become my novel, The Book of Miles. But while I was writing that book, which was essentially about the moving of the town and all the stories in that area, I was searching for an authentic Australian voice. I'm not from the country, I am of the country, but I grew up in the city. And when I went to live in the Midda Valley, a little place called Tallandoon, I felt mildly adrift, mildly transposed. And I was seeking an oracle, a cicerone, someone who could guide me in this strange land. And I stumbled across a poem called Driving Through Sawmill Towns. And the Midda and Astle and Tallandoon, these were sawmill towns. This was timber country. It was dairy country as well, which of course is Les's other vocation. But he knows sawmill towns and dairy towns like no one else I know. And the poem I am going to read you, because this is probably the most seminal poem for me, only because it was the first that I may have read in full and that connected with me wholly, is on page 2 if you have the book with you, and if you don't, I hope you enjoy the reading. I will be chatting for about maybe 20 minutes, and James will be reading 1 or 2 poems as well, and then we'll have a Q&A session. James and I'll have a chat about Les, and then it's over to you, any questions you've got, as so I understand things.
Yes, well, that's fine. But if you do have a question, there will be, the ushers will sort of be at the side, so there'll be a visual cue. When you see them there, you can just put up your hand and you can butt in at any time. Okay.
Thank you. All right, well, without any more ado, which I know is that I said that deliberately, malapropisms, I love them. Driving through sawmill towns. In the high, cool country, having come from the clouds, down a tilting road into a distant valley, you drive without haste. Your windscreen parts the forest, swaying and glancing, and jammed midday brilliance crouches in clearings. And then you come across them. The sawmill towns, bare hamlets built of boards, with perhaps a store, perhaps a bridge beyond, and a little sidelong creek alive with pebbles. The mills are roofed with iron, have no walls. You look straight in as you pass, see lithe men working. The swerve of a winch, dim, dazzling blades advancing, through a trolley-borne trunk till it sags apart in a manifold sprawl of weatherboards and battens. The men watch you pass. When you stop your car and ask for directions, tall youths look away. It is the older men who come out in blue singlets and talk softly to you. Beside each mill, smoke trickles out of mounds of ash and sawdust. You glide on through town, your mudguards damp with cloud. The houses there wear verandas out of shyness. All day in calendared kitchens, women listen for cars on the road. Lost children in the bush. A cry from the mill. A footstep. Nothing happens. The half-heard radio sings its song of sidewalks. Sometimes a woman, sweeping her front step, or a plain young wife at a tank stand fetching water in a metal bucket will turn around and gaze at the mountains in wonderment, looking for a city. Evenings are very quiet. All around the forest is there. As night comes down, the houses watch each other. A light going out in a window here has meaning. You speed away through the upland, glare through towns, and are gone in the forest, glowing on far hills. On summer nights, ground crickets sing and pause. In the dark of winter, tin roofs sour with rain. Downpipes chafe in the wind, agog with water. Men sit after tea by the stove while their wives talk, rolling a dead match between their fingers, thinking of the future. You know what? I could actually speak for 20 minutes on that particular poem, and particularly that phrase, dead match. I love the dead match. It's a very Les Murray trait where he will finish a poem with a tangential insight or codex to where he's going with or what he's sort of driving at. He does it several times, including that wonderful poem where he's upstaged by an archaeological find, and he likens his own body to owning an apartment in Venice. That is, we're all here temporarily. We all have these ephemeral physiques. But the other thing that comes out of Les Murray poems, I think, that is many of the key poems, is the road. He's obsessed by this transition, this sort of A to B. There's a real journey. I hate that word. Reality TV has really debased it. But there is a journey in a lot of his poems, and it's not just the journey of an argument or the journey of exploring a metaphor. There often is a road. And a couple of the other poems we're going to look at actually have that road motif coming through them. And the next one I want to focus on is actually from, how could you go past this as a poem title? It's called The Bulla Dealer Taree Holiday Song Cycle. Sounds fantastic. And now I feel like a chaplain, because I'm going to say this is from Song 6, line at page 24, and it's an alternative to the road experience. We're going to hear about people, to give you some context, about people water skiing on the Mile Lakes. So these are people who have travelled on the road to be where they want to be for their holidays. And James, if you could read that one, which I think's on page 24. And we're taking it from...
Yes.
Just, again, for those who want to follow... it's on page 24, and there's a line there about sort of a quarter of the way down. They rise up. So we're going to take it from that line.
Okay. Sorry, I can't see because there's a microphone in front of it. There we go.
These are water skis, right? Just get in mind water skiing.
Okay. They rise up as charioteers, leaning back on the tow bar. All their attributes bulge at once. Swapping swash shoulder wings for the white-sheeted shoes that bear them. They are skidding over the flat glitter, stiff with grace, for once not travelling to arrive. From the high dunes over there, the rough blue distance, at length they come back behind the boats, and behind the boat's noise, cartwheeling or sitting down into the lake's warm chair. They wade ashore and eat with the families, putting off that uprightness, that assertion, eating with the families who love equipment and the freedom from equipment, with the fathers who love driving and lighting a fire between stones.
Okay, so they are, for once, travelling not to arrive. It's just such a beautiful idea. Carving a road in the lake, carving a path, and then reassembling as a family, as a tribal group, to make fire amongst stones. The Indigenous echo of that is deliberate, because as part of this song cycle are the Indigenous lines that run through that same area. Les himself is turning 75 this year, grew up in that country, and in fact he's since gone back there after a long time in Sydney, living in a place, it's between Coolagalook and Buckawaka, or something along those lines. when I said to a mate last week that I was going to talk about Les Murray, he goes, "Oh, a terrific football commentator. He really was. He is one of the best." I said, "No, the other bloke, yeah, the Bard of Bunya." He goes, "What position did he play?" So anyway, what I also love about that poem, why I selected that, is because I think most poets, particularly urbanites, would deride the writers behind the jet skis or the towboats. It's very tempting to do that, and yet there's a real dignity about what really let's say the sort of, what do we say, the acquisitive class of people who just think that holidays equal as much as you can pack into the back trailer, and they've got. There's a talk about their barbecues, which are like tripods of steel with heat shimmer of sauces. It's almost delicious. You actually want to join them. And I love that about Les. He has a real common touch, despite his gargantuan vocab and his dazzling intelligence. He never loses touch with the handle of an axe or his fellow man. And for that reason, I think he does have a real affinity with the land and also with the Indigenous people. He is a man of the soil. And I just think that's a really salient lesson for any writer too, to just not to get too big for your boots. Certainly what he's avoided. For all of the accolades that he's received worldwide, he has a real sensibility for the vernacular and for the vernacular republic. Now, this is it may seem a departure, but it's the other reason why I love Les Murray. It's again of a road theme, but this is about stories in the landscape. And if you could remember that moment at the historical marker, it was stories in the landscape that I wanted to elicit. And Murray helped me, like an usher, led me to these stories. He gave me the belief that I can find these stories because they are lurking in rooms and in streets and in alleyways. Stories are everywhere. And this poem is about Les getting jack of all the monarchic, highfalutin names that are attributed to streets. Streets that really we live in and we belong in, and yet they have a kind of disjunct in their nomenclature. So this one's called Reclaim the Sites. Again, has a very strong, if you think about it, a very strong Indigenous feel to it. Just that title alone. Sounds like something that could well be on a placard outside the tent embassy. Reclaim the Sites. And it's on page 225. And James, if you could read this one in full, please.
I would be glad to.
Thank you.
Reclaim the sites. We are spared the avenues of liberation and the water-cannoned 5th of May, but I tire of cities clogged with salutes to other cities, York, Liverpool, Oxford streets, and memorial royalty, Elizabeth, Albert, William, unnumbered George. Give me Sally Huckstep Road ahead of Sepia Sussex or Argyll or Yankee numbering. And why not a whole metropolis, street signed for its own life and ours? Child's Play Park and First Bra Avenue. Unsecured loan, the Boulevard Kiss, Radar Strip, Bread Fragrance Corner, Fumble Trouser, Delight Bridge, Timeless Square.
Yeah, that... I understand there was a plaque, a series of plaques actually in Paris that had been put up by a prankster. It went along the lines of, let's say, Jacques Smith scratched his nose here, and Jacques Smith kissed his second girlfriend here, and Jacques Smith lost his lecture notes in this news agency. And I do like that idea that we ignore the filigree of the capillaries of stories that overlay the city unless we really go actively seek to find them. Of course, we have our own and we can intermingle with others, but it's a matter of actually going out and finding them or overhearing them. And it is about story. Les is very strong on the narrative. Not that every poem has a narrative, but he's a great yarner. I've only met him once, and that was when we were deciding which was to be the word of the year for the Macquarie Dictionary in 2012. And I was such a fan that I didn't want to say that I was a fan. But to my shame, he was very strong on the word dairyness, and I voted him down with burkini. So when you see that the Macquarie Dictionary got burkini as the 2012 word of the year, then know that it was me. I had not the casting vote by any means, but by weight of numbers, I actually muscled out dairyness. I think Les went off in a bit of a huff. Probably thought burkini, what's that bloody word? You know, where's that come from? He's the most unlikely laureate in that I think he had a gravy stain on his t-shirt, and he did have bare feet on. It was in January, admittedly, but at Sydney University, you know, the august halls, we were with chancellors and vice chancellors and lexicographers, and Les was just there, pretty much off the farm. Very giggly, loves a laugh, and I was I don't know if starstruck's the word, but you know when you meet an idol. Someone that you really admired, whose work you've admired, sometimes you just get tongue-tied or you don't want to embarrass yourself. But in a way, when I was invited to be part of this series, I thought, well, even if Les is not in the room, maybe he'll download this. He doesn't own a computer. Or maybe he'll just know, oh, at least that snowy bastard who voted for bikini, at least he's got some sense of grace about him. All right. Now, there's a poem in here. It's called A Lego of Driving to Sydney. I don't know why he calls it a Lego. I think maybe that was an old atlas. It's on page 178, and it's 4 generations of taking cattle or driving down from Taree area, Bunya area, down to Sydney for the Royal Show. And it's a lovely poem. I'm not going to read it tonight, but just to show you how important that idea of the road is with his poems. He talks about, you know, having Billy Tees along the road. That's the first generation. The second generation is, I think, the asphalt started at Chatswood, and respite lay in the waiting for the punts for the river crossings. And then the third generation, we were starting to get into radar traps, and then the fourth generation was all about tweets and freeways and tollways, and it just highlights how this the roads and the stories seem to tattoo their way into our consciousness. But anyway, just below that poem, on the facing page 179, is probably one of his best recited and most enshrined poems, because it's a very, very personal one. To read about Les Murray's biography is to be haunted. He had this kind of Grecian mythological, really tragic upbringing. He lost his mother when he was 12 of her third miscarriage, and the reason that she died due to excessive hemorrhage was because his father had this one maternal gift from his mother, that is Les's grandmother, which was this car that was never working. But he loved his mother so much, Les's grandmother, that he never parted with this car. And so when his mum was essentially dying, and Les blamed himself because he was an only child, and she never seemed to have any. She always had trouble with childbirth after that. Then the car didn't work. They couldn't get to the hospital. Can you just imagine the sense of doom and foreboding and celestial blame that rested on his shoulders as a 12-year-old, the only child of a man who'd been dispossessed by his father. Les's father was a wood fetcher and had been promised this land by his own father, Les's grandfather, but this ended up being a Welsh promise. And so the father was kind of trapped. And then, if that's not bad enough, the Archie, who was Les's uncle, was told to go and cut down a tree because the other useless bastard wouldn't do it. And Les's father said, "Don't touch that tree. Don't touch that tree. It's got termites all the way through it." And Archie went ahead and cut it down, and the tree landed upon him and just smote him down. So this is this biblical, weird, writ large story that he's come from. And also because a man of ample physique as he was, teased mercilessly at school and became extremely depressed, as though he didn't have anywhere he could belong. he found poetry, and thank Christ for that. These 4 lines essentially just summarise what I was rabbiting on about for the last 3.5 minutes. It's called Burning Want, and 179, it's a kind of talisman to help you understand Les Murray. From just on puberty, I lived in funeral. Mother dead of miscarriage, father trying to be dead. We'd boil sweat brown cloth. Cows repossessed the garden. Love-making brought death was the unuttered principle. All my names were fat names at the Newtown school. He found love. He found love in a young girl who committed suicide when Les was in his late teens. Thank Christ he found poetry. But of course he does have the black dog. That is depression. He's been living with it for a long time as a result of that kind of upbringing. And possibly his own genetics too, because his father also became a griefaholic, in Les's words. And of course, to express this idea of depression and battle, there's a great quote he said. He says, if I've got the black dog and the black dog makes me cry, I'm going to make the bastards sing. And he converts depression into the power of poetry. And what does he use as the motif? The road. He uses a wonderful poem called Corniche, which is the poem that I did hear him read out in person, not at that dictionary meeting at the Melbourne Writers' Festival a few years ago. It's on page 158. I'm just going to read you an excerpt from it because I'm aware of the time as well. And it goes, Corniche, by the way, because in fact Les has taught me many words. Corniche is one of them. It's essentially a road that cuts close to a cliff edge. The Great Ocean Road is a corniche. He's taught me many words like peneplain, which is eroded flatlands, or marva, which is a stone used for moulding stone, cullet, which is waste glass. I also love that he can talk about common things like water skiing and then use a word like palimpsest to describe the lake. He gets me. Okay, this poem, I'll just finish it maybe. I'll just start 158. He's talking about Corniche. He's talking about living along the edge of this road that is his existence, that is living with depression and fear of the inevitable, fear of owning that apartment in Venice. And I'm going to take it from the third stanza. It was the victim sickness, and take it up only until about halfway down the other page. Corniche. It was the victim sickness, adrenaline howling in my head. The black dog was my brain. Come to drown me in my breath was energy's black hole, depression, compare of the pre-dawn show, when, returned from a pee, you stew and welter in your death. The rogue space rock is on course to snuff your world, sure, but go acute and its oncoming fills your day. The brave die but once. I could go 100 times a week, clinging to my pulse with the world's edge inches away. Laugh who never shrank around wizened genitals there or killed themselves to be stopped dying. The blow that never falls batters you stupid. Only gradually do you notice a slight scorn in you for what appalls. But the good news is, as disabling and overwhelming as depression can be, and obviously a great handicap to writing elegiac poetry, he finds remedy in writing. And he actually finds remedy in a remarkable poem that I want to finish on. In my reading about Les Murray for this event, I know that he has this study where he has several sacred items surrounding his desk. There are 2 or 3 peacock feathers that are stuck into a blue bottle. For some reason he has the front cover of the Otago phone directory. I don't know why he's got that. Doesn't explain. There's no footnotes attached to these. One is a Javanese wooden sun. He's got photos of his parents, and he's got photos of his 5 children. He also has he's numerous awards around the place. But the other thing that he has is this photo of a Swiss high mountain road. It's almost like a goat track. And he looks at it And it's almost, for him, I think, a touchstone of what he lives with every day. But he also realises that that same little goat trail on this, absolutely vertiginous Swiss Alp that people use seasonally to come up to the uplands for the sheep and goat to feed. That means what it represents to Murray, I assert, is this determination, this human determination to overcome fear, to overcome the sort of terror of death, the terror of the drop, the terror of the inevitable. And the path they leave is a road that runs through his poetry, and in many ways the poetry is the path that Les Murray will lead. This one's called the Annals of Shear. The Annals of Shear. Let's get that right. Let's get the pronunciation right. 213. And this is the last one. But to finish on that idea of the road, and also the road being a triumphant image for Murray. Remember the last one's talked about a windscreen? Crack on a windscreen or seeing through the windscreen? And this is one of the last poems in the book. And sure enough, the opening line. The Annals of Shear. Like a crack across a windscreen, this alpine sheep track winds around buttress cliffs of sheer. No guardrail anywhere. Like cobweb round a coat, it threads a bare rock. World too steep for soil to cling, stark as poor people's need. High plateau pasture must be great, and coming this way to it, or from it, must save days for men to have inched across traverses, sometimes since the Ice Age, and then, with knock and hammer, pitching reminders overside, wedged a pavement 2 sheep wide. In the international sign code, this would be my pictograph for cold horror. But generations have led their flocks down and up this flow pipe, where any spurt or check in deliberate walking could bring overspill and barrelling far down to puffs of smash and ruin. To ruin, which these men have had the calm skills on refrozen mist footing to prevent, since before hammers hit iron. Thanks.
Thank you very much, David. And just before I ask you my first question, I'll say when you do see the ushers walking outside with the microphones, feel free to put up your hand and ask a question if you have any. When you emailed me and said you were going to talk about the road, I was sure you were going to, and you were talking about the Tare Bulladale holiday cycle, I was sure you were going to talk about part 2, the second part, and you didn't. And I'm just... Maybe we should talk about it now, because that seems to me a really fantastic example of Murray's use of the road as a metaphor, but also of the extraordinary metaphorical richness of his poetry.
Well, tell us about it, because
because
might be helpful too.
I think it's my favourite section of that poem. It's right at the beginning, isn't it? Where we have it.
So that would be on page
20.
20. Mm-hmm.
Where, I mean, I don't know, I won't read it all out, it's 15, 20 lines, must be more. But what's interesting, the way it moves through the different metaphors, I'm not sure it actually uses the word road, but it starts with describing it as a long, narrow city. That image of the column of cars heading north out of Sydney, and at various times, and at night with all the headlines. Yeah. And it moves through these kind of series of metaphors. Go through. It's compared to a snake, of course, and it's described as burning at one point. The lights. It's described as then as a pipe. Then it becomes a gut.
It's a great image, isn't it?
Yeah, and the gut has parasites, which are the police who are booking people for speeding and collecting revenue, and. Then it comes this fantastic line, digesting the towns, feeding the towns, which is a wonderfully ambiguous, sort of paradoxical metaphor. And under all that, it has that Aboriginal mythological image of the snake.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So there's that really interesting interplay between the mythical, the metaphorical, and the material world going on there.
And that the whole series is deliberately called Song Cycle too, I'm sure, because of the like song lines in a way. They are, every town, every street name, every place has its story, and this is the summer story. This is the onset of the city.
And of course, it was based. He used an Aboriginal poem as the model for its metre. In fact, boasted that it was the first poem to be written in this particular metre. The Moon Bone song, it's called.
I didn't know that. Wow, that's fascinating.
No, it was translated. He wrote a translation by a guy called R.M. Burnt, which struck him, and he used it as the basis for the song.
Wonderful. No, I must investigate that further.
Yeah. But place names are important too, aren't they?
Very much. Yeah, in fact, he never says that he comes from kind of west of Taree. He's very particular about the names, and it's it's the Sally Ann Huckstep principle. He thinks that the true names hold the history of a place, whether that's an Indigenous name or whether it's the Fumble Boulevard. It's that's places deserve the vestiges of humanity.
Yeah, and the palpability of those Aboriginal names too. There's the wonderful sort of polysyllabic words. He makes great use of it, doesn't he?
That's the other thing too that I really love about Murray is that I didn't talk about this in the chat then, but he's very playful. While he won't do complete sledgehammer puns or dad jokes, he has this ability to, in terms of sound, he will talk about, the drip of the rain tank is just debit, debit, debit. The zip of a briefcase is valise, valise, valise. And then he uses these little...
is it the Rosellas in the song cycle? They say, we think.
And the other thing too I found interesting, that something that came out of a Paris Review interview that he did in 2005, he deliberately channeled the animals. There's a whole series of poems where he channels the sonic interplay of bats, and he talks about he uses a really wonderful collective sort of first person for a herd of cows. He does Rosella noises. He does all sorts of mimicry of animals. He channels animals, and he does that. He did that as a means of trying to derail the black dog. Speaking of animals, he thought I could possibly be someone else. It's a means of escaping myself.
Well, one of the ones I actually had marked is Lyrebird. Are you familiar with that one?
I am, yeah. Which has that wonderful line about mimicry is I.
Yes, but it's... And that poem and another one I had there was the one about getting this cobwebs on your fingers. There's something really interesting about those poems where the language, they're almost revelling in kind of pure sound at certain points. And it points to a kind of interesting contradiction in Murray's writing, as he's often been quite outspoken about wanting poetry to reach a wide audience. He's generally been quite, openly scornful of sort of modern writing and modernism for its alienating of its audience, its deliberate alienation of its audience. Yet there are points in some of these poems where it's worked to such a pitch that the sense actually becomes obscure, and it kind of breaks down into this sort of wordplay.
But he also maintains, which I really love as a puzzle maker, is that a poem shouldn't be savoured at first lick. So in other words, there is the latent as well as the patent. And that's something he does really well. Like you recognise this is about the summer holiday queue to get to Mile Lakes, but then he'll throw in a metaphor or that little tangential envoy that I was talking about that makes you come away slightly puzzled. I think that's a good thing. I mean, it doesn't always work. Sometimes the opacity is annoying. I think in one of these poems I actually just put down in the margins mystery. I just couldn't fathom what it was about. But that's all right too. I think one of his favourite poets was Anne Sexton, because he admired the fact that she never signed off on a poem. There was a sense of it bleeding beyond the frame. And I think he does the same with a lot of his diffractions. That's my theory anyway.
Yeah, well, actually, I have a quote here, just in the spirit of reciting things, where he talks about the experience of reading a poem, what he thinks the experience of reading a poem is, which it's just a few lines, I'll read it out. He says, "It is marked by a strange simultaneity of stillness and racing excitement. Our mind wants to hurry on and have more and more of it, but at the same time it is held by an awe which yearns to prolong the moment and experience it as timeless. We only half notice consciously that our breathing has tightened and altered, submitting to commands from beyond ourselves. We may say that the poem is dancing us to its rhythm, even as we sit apparently still, reading it. It is discreetly borrowing our body to embody itself. The poem is a paradoxical entity, both finite and exhausting."
It's a beautiful excerpt.
And it seems to me that in his poetry there's that idea of palpability and embodiment is so important to him. I mean, he's not a poet of interiority. You know, he's a poet of the physical world and capturing that world in the kind of palpability of his own language. I think.
If he is interior, it's through the agency of the external. I mean, he said that growing up with the elements was the true godsend as a child. But he also said that I know that his writing technique, he often writes in transit, which shouldn't surprise anyone given what the motif of my address. He actually loves writing when he's travelling and usually then assembles and finds the right pitch of his poems when he's settled. But sometimes he works longer beyond his accustomed hours, as he says it, when the fish are running deep. And again, it's the physical, but it's that idea of the mystery of a poem and trying to catch something. And it's he turns to the elemental to express that. Yeah.
Well, yes, and when you were talking about the road and the cliff, there's these two directions. There's the going forward, and then there's the drop. You know, and if you've got to keep going forward.
Well, it's also, I guess, as a poet, it's good to have too. It's the sort of fear of the banal line, or the sentimentality, or the self-importance, or possibly, you know, not being true to yourself. I mean, he is a great adversary of modernism. I think he calls it a lot of it sort of bullet in the back of the head writing.
Well, yes. I have another quote here. I've come armed with some quotes this evening. He said this is from an essay from 1988. He said, "Literary modernism is totalitarian politics in literary disguise, while totalitarian politics is modernist literature with no disguise at all." He also said that in the same essay that the Enlightenment is a Luciferian poem, that is, one in revolt against poetry itself. Now that strikes me as a little harsh. I don't kind of agree with him on that point, and I actually think it's interesting. You know, that's why I think it's interesting the way he does use language and the way his language is almost forced back to that kind of concentration just by virtue of his own talent, almost.
Yeah, look, he in fact, I read. Speaking of, you know, his kind of towering talents, I do know that his cousin, as I said to you in the green room, is Sir James Murray, who was the founding editor of the Oxford English Dictionary. And he did say a little vaingloriously, and I'm sure tongue-in-cheek, that there's a verbal genius in every century of our family. And he actually says, "Damn it, we own the language." But he never becomes that tin pot king that he's so concerned about when it comes to these grand New York movements, as he puts them. He finds a lot of it sort of like a gulag writing, where people aren't being true to their natures. It's just observing the zeitgeist or the ideology of the day. But which is why, look, I don't think he's, you know, all the way with Les Murray, but I do think he is a polarising figure. And if you were to say that you were going to, you know, discuss Les Murray this evening, I'm sure you would have got a couple of curled lips saying, Les Murray, right? You know, I don't know what where that comes from precisely, but he is one of those figures that very quickly bundles up poetry as good and bad without really giving it due scrutiny. I would think if he recognised it as being modernist, then I think he has the tendency, particularly in his later years, to be a bit more dismissive of it rather than giving it, its full grace. But that's only a presumption on my part. But certainly he's very quick to pigeonhole things that he finds odious.
Well, there is that slightly embattled sense in some of his poetry too.
There
A
is.
sense that there are, even in the Holiday Cycle, which is quite an affirming poem, there is that sense of a kind of class divide. I mean, it's quite interesting, that poem. Even though it's a holiday poem, it's very concerned with work. Did you?
It's
notice
true,
that?
actually.
There's a lot of work. I mean, the animals are working. There is the ibis, I think, is working.
And that's where it says the swallows the shocked or the appalled croak of a frog. The ibis that's working.
Yes, which is as being swallowed.
Great.
He swallows the croak.
He swallows the croak of an appalled frog. I just think it's a great line. I feel like that's part of the depression too. Like one day this ibis is just this sort of grand ibis, celestial ibis, just despite all your protest.
I should say if you do have a question, shoot your hand up. We have gone down here.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a couple of things, and I don't know if there's time for all of this, but being an old Sydney boy myself, I want to bring something up. I know that David Astle is. One is, did Les Murray and Lindsay Brown ever cross paths?
Lindsay Brown being the crossword maker, for those who don't know.
And also the film reviewer, yeah.
Yeah, he was.
But no, it's more this, that for a while Les lived in the caves in the cliffs below, between Waverley Cemetery and the Pacific Ocean.
Oh, I never knew that.
And that above him, so he and others, that they were the homeless, lived down there, and some children, I'm not going to name any, identify any of them, would go around and drop stones down through their little chimneys, because their chimneys had sit up through the rocks, and they were down below somewhere. So Les lived there for a while. Now above him, and leaching down through the earth to his cliff face, looking out on the earth, were the distinguished dead of Sydney.
That's
amongst
right.
them Henry Lawson.
Henry Lawson was part of it. Was amongst that number.
Was amongst that. So, and I wondered if you saw or felt a reflection or traces somewhere in his work of that. That's what
I'm surprised he hasn't written about that phase of life, because it's so rich with poetry the way you've described it.
Well, yeah, isn't it? And I want to ask one other thing too, because about playing later stuff like Freddie Neptune. He is inviting you, isn't he, there to make the connections yourself. The strong man who used to be at one time in a carnival where he dressed in tights and a cape and showed his extraordinary strength. In the goods yards in Cleveland, he has to. A man is trapped under a fallen diesel engine, and Freddie's got to use his extraordinary strength to lift him up, and that impresses everyone around. And two young blokes who, in the future, are hoping to be journalists of some kind. They ask him, "Where'd you get that strength from?" And he spins them a whole tale about where he came from, how he's an alien from another world. Their names, Siegel and Schuster. How many of us can make that connection?
Yeah.
Okay, the Superman comic, Siegel and Schuster wrote that. So Les is playing games with us, but isn't he also trying to link us into the popular culture of generations gone by? And the criterion of a classic is if it outlives its creators into the next generation, it's a classic. Superman, for whatever else you want to think about, it's become a classic.
It's true. I think that's the trail that he wants to leave. I do know that with he was asked why he never touches prose. I mean, aside from his essays, that's quite true. It's always verse. And even Freddie Neptune, which I think is possibly the longest verse novel, certainly written in Australia, if not globally. It's an amazing work. He says that he eschews prose because he doesn't think it's built to last. He thinks poetry is everlasting, and he goes on further to say that there's something that's quite odious about crafting plot, because it's this human attempt to manufacture fate. Which he finds reprehensible. But it's for those who really want to sort of swim in Les, then Freddie Neptune's a wonderful... take it away for the summer and you'll be lost.
Well, it's hence the kind of picaresque aspect of no plot. It's one thing after another.
It is. It's more of that...
and it's also, I think it fits in with the road metaphor
very much.
too. I mean, the first poem, the Sawmill Town poem, it's almost like he's a kind of flaneur. It's him. There's this kind of timelessness to the setting. Sort of timelessness without it being kind of nostalgic, but he's also looking at this sort of older way of life from a motorised vehicle.
Yeah, that's right, through that windscreen. He The other thing too about I lost my train of thought at the road and lost that one. Come back to it.
Was there anyone else with a question? No? Yes, one down the front. Oh, there's a microphone.
Thank you. I grew up in the Australia that Les writes about, being a little younger than him but similar age.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, I grew up in Tasmania, and it was a very closed community. And I wonder, I can identify with his Australia, but I wondered about the people of other countries who come here and adopt Australia as their home, or we adopt them. How would they identify with the Australia that he talks about in those poems?
Well, I think there's every chance that they could connect, because there's something that's quite unvarnished about his language, even for all the care and the carpentry that goes into his verse. So I think, if you hark your mind back to that very first poem, the Sawmill towns, there's hardly a word in there that's over 2 or 3 syllables, and there's not, and the imagery is crisp and not too heavily laboured. So I suppose it's the cultural largesse that Les draws on that may be a point of division or a point of distance, but that's surely an aspirational distance. It's as we travel, as we enter another country, if we wish to connect, we try and understand and fathom the culture that this the nation around us owns and is willing to share. I think it was controversially no small accident that he was invited to come up and rephrase the Oath of Allegiance to Australia, even though that was a little bit of a thankless task. I think there is something about the everyman in Les that has that ability to translate and connect. Can't promise you that, but I think there's hope in his verse for others to assemble, and connect. The thing I was going to remember, you were talking about being embattled. That is certainly, he does have a large wood chip on his shoulder, I'd have to say, having met the man briefly and having read about him extensively, and a lot of that is to do with being essentially of poverty-stricken country, white trash, working class. They were almost dispossessed. They, ranges dripped through the nail holes. And when he went to Sydney Uni, he was teased mercilessly at school. He just became crippled with depression. And when he went to Sydney University, he didn't attend any of the classes. He just kind of created a garrison out of the
I think
the
he
library.
sat in the Fisher Library.
Yeah, he did. He basically just absorbed Fisher Library, and then he went. He hit the road and probably ended up on those cliff faces below the cemetery. And so he's kind of, and also really despises the kind of urban elite. Can't stand elitism and can't stand the sort of the sort of country working class are just put into these kind of feeding pens of prejudice, and so that it's always this sense of, as he controversially said, every poem has to work out who or what to kill. He's very forceful about his poetry, and I think it's about just putting that attitude to rights.
Yeah, well, I think that's really one of the really interesting things about him is the way those things are held in tension in his poetry. To return to your original point, I think, all literature is parochial in a sense. It's all coming from somewhere quite concrete and specific. Everybody has a kind of ethnic background and an inheritance, a cultural inheritance of some kind, and all writers reflect that in their work. But at the same time, there is that sense in Murray that he's dividing. He does quite like to divide the world into the good guys and the bad guys, the oppressors, the police. Even in the song, in the first line, there's even a hint of that in where he makes the distinction between whether the people are eating dinner in that country house north of Leggs Lake, behind fly-wiring Venetians in the dimmed cool, town people eat lunch. Straight first line, there's this subtle class marker. Some people eat dinner, some people eat lunch. Yeah,
it's very true. He can't get away from it. It is part of his part of his complicated charm.
Yeah, I think in some cases it doesn't enhance his poetry. I mean, I'm thinking of the last lines of the last hellos. You know, where it's about this very moving poem about the death of his father. If I can quickly look it up.
Yeah. I think it's about 180, 188 or something like that.
Yes. Sorry. 181. The last stanza, after this extraordinarily moving tribute to his dying father, he says, "Snobs mind us off religion nowadays, if they can. Fuck them, I wish you God." Now, as he's expressing his belief, but at the same time, there's something kind of gratuitous about at that moment to be, directing the anger outwards. And for me, that's one of the really awkward things about Murray's poetry. For all his linguistic genius, he has that element. I have a father who's close to death at the moment, and I read that poem only this morning and got dewy-eyed. And I particularly love that that closing piece because there's something that is you wish to throw your vitriol outwards. It's the emotion is real.
The emotion is, I think,
it's
very
grief turning to anger.
Yeah, it's an authentic impulse, and I also think it's the only time he drops the F-bomb in this whole anthology, and I think it's very timely. So it's kind of like this kickback against the hypocrisy. He did come from the sort of the Scottish Kirk Presbyterianism, which was a very unforgiving religion, and he converted to Catholicism not just because his wife is Catholic, because he found that as the one big poem. He really embraced the poetry of Catholicism. He said that a true religion is where the God gives you his flesh and blood rather than you having to part with yours.
Yes, one more quick question.
You'd probably in that the book there is The Mitchells, which I consider to be a very delicate observation that Les makes of two men.
Not sure if it is actually, but anyway.
The Mitchells.
I have a feeling it might not be.
A short poem.
Oh no, it is. It is.
Yes, you're quite right.
The observation that you mentioned about the rolling of the dead match, there's some delicacy to that, and I think that in his observation of these two brothers in that short poem, The Mitchells, he does have this delicacy, which is a revealing thing in Les Murray's work, I think.
He does. In fact, when he's describing the Aboriginal cricketer, which is, I think, the only, if we count water skiing, he only mentions sport 5 times in this book, and one being a tennis match where his parents met. There's fencing, there's fishing, there's the Aboriginal cricketer. And my point being that he says to this man in a kind of fatherly advice, he says, keep it noble, keep it light. And I think that reflects your comment, that for all his gargantuan virtues as a wordsmith and as a polyglot, he does have this incredible delicate touch. He's like, for me, he's a heavyweight champion, if I can use a sporting metaphor. But he's one of those that moves, like the butterfly. And when he gets the image right, as he often does, it has that bee-like sting to it.
I think we've got another question up there. We are nearly out of time, so if you have got any questions, you've got to put your hand up. I
was going to mention The Mitchells, which is one of my favourite poems, because you were talking about bleeding out of the landscape, and I remember the last half line is something like, sometimes the scene is an avenue. And that extraordinary non sequitur, it just makes my blood run backwards, and I was wondering, it's nearly the end of the talk, if you can put your finger on the magic, how he makes it work.
Well, I suppose there's a truism in playwriting that a play becomes boring if the audience gets ahead of the story. It's just a precept that you need to remember as a writer. The same applies in prose too. And I think that he puts that aphorism into action with his poetry. There's something that continues to surprise you, and there's a belief. I think this is from Margaret Atwood. My orientation is more short story. I mean, poetry is something that I usually tap into when I'm writing prose, because it's separate from prose and yet it has such a crystalline quality to it that I find it really refreshing and invigorating my prose. But there's something that Margaret Atwood said about that a good story should go beyond the frame, and an ending should be the emphasis of the truth. I think what Murray does so often in the ends or the envoys of his poems is he surprises you with a different aspect of the truth. It's like you're reading this. The example that came to mind is when he's at Oxford University and he's been upstaged by the discovery of all these skeletons in an adjoining room. There'd been some annex of the art facility. And they discovered all these skeletons. They were laid out on tables. They were like ginger matchsticks, and they were possible relatives of Les Murray. And then he finishes with that Venetian, apartment. And I just think, what? That's part of the magic, I believe, that he has this complete, unblinking gaze upon a subject matter, and then he can do a little sort of twist and give it just an aftershadow or a strangeness to it.
Well, this is from the poem Poetry and Religion. Full religion is the large poem in loving repetition. Like any poem, it must be inexhaustible and complete, with turns where we ask, now why did the poet do that?
Well, let's put it best. Yeah.
We're actually over time. There's no more questions? No? Look, thank you all for coming along. Thank you, David Astle, for that very enjoyable conversation. And I hope to see you all next month when I believe Kate Kennedy will be here to talk about Amy Whittig. So do come along.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.